Quick, how many prime ministers can you name? It should be an easy question, but increasingly these days it is not, especially among younger Canadians. My next guest learned that lesson the hard way, as he was told no one really teaches about prime ministers anymore. Well, not if he has something to say about it. Here to talk about the prime ministers, Canada's leaders, and the nation they shaped is award-winning educator, writer, commentator, and public speaker, J.D.M. Stewart. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I've wanted to speak with you for some time, going back to 2018 when you published your first book, Being Prime Minister. This book, The Prime Ministers, is the first of its kind to come out in more than 25 years. As you put it, past time for a fresh look at the 24 individuals who have served as Prime Minister of Canada since the nation's birth in 1867. Now, so much has changed in Canadian historiography since then, since the turn of the millennium, but that's not why you wrote the book. At least it wasn't the spark. You were giving a presentation to an assembly of high school students about Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson. Tell me what happened next.
So, in front of this group of really knowledgeable Model United Nations kids, I asked them who was on my screen, and the screen was labeled with Pearson's name, but they didn't know who he was. And I was a bit surprised by that. And that's when I ended up speaking to the teacher afterward who said, yeah, we don't really teach prime ministers anymore. And, I had spent 30 years being a history teacher, and I certainly taught prime ministers. And so I was a little concerned that others were looking at history differently. And I thought, I've got to do something about this now that I'm not in the classroom as much anymore. And so I decided to write a new book, a new interpretation, a new history of Canada's prime ministers. And as you said off the top, it had been more than 25 years since we had one. And so it was time to get a new book and a fresh interpretation for people to brush up on their prime ministers or be introduced to them for the first time.
What was going through your mind when you heard that disconnect about Pearson? And what do you think it says about the way history is taught in this country?
We've been battling the issue of how Canadian history is taught or not taught, as the case may be, because many provinces don't teach about Canadian prime ministers. And I think there's lately been a disinclination to teach about what we might say is the great man theory of history. And I guess there's an aversion to teaching leadership political history because in many cases it involves white men, and that's been kind of frowned upon. But we can't really do anything about the past when the history of our prime ministers is 23 men and one woman. And I think regardless of whether they're white or brown or Indigenous, whatever the case may be, they are the person who occupied the office, and we should be teaching what happened in that office. I'll just tell you, there was an interesting quote that I have in my book from Peter C. Newman, who used to live in British Columbia. And he said, an hour in the office of prime minister is an hour in the history of the country. And I think that's an important point for all of us to understand.
Now, when we talk about the changes since the last major popular history of the prime ministers was written, and we talk about how certain prime ministers are remembered, I think it's quite fair to say that no prime minister has seen a greater change in recent years than Sir John A. Macdonald. We talk about the idea of today's scoundrel is tomorrow's hero, and vice versa. What was sort of the turning point for Macdonald in terms of historiography?
I think when the Truth and Reconciliation report came out in 2015, and we started to take a new look at the history of residential schools, and we know that Sir John A. Macdonald had a hand in the beginning of those schools in 1883. And a lot of people were really upset by that, and were looking for a scapegoat for their anger about what happened to our Indigenous people. And we know that many people rightly were horrified about the conditions and the things that happened in residential schools. And so people started taking down Macdonald statues. The one in Victoria is no longer out, it's in storage. But I think since then, though, we've started to see that Johnny Macdonald is not the only prime minister who bears responsibility for what happened to Indigenous people in Canada. Every prime minister has had a hand in not fixing the problems or exacerbating them. And now I think we're starting to look at Macdonald in a slightly more nuanced way, where we're realizing that history is not just black and white, There is a context of what happens in history that is certainly very important, whether it's 1885 or 1975. It's different points in our history, and we have to take a look at a broader context on things. And this is not to make excuses, John, for the regrettable actions of John A. Macdonald or any other prime minister. It's just to say that we have to have a wider lens on that when we're making judgments such as this.
Now, as you point out, it's strange that MacDonald is remembered for this particular aspect of his record, of his years in power, not something like the Electoral Franchise Bill, which was exceptionally progressive for its time. What was so
Right.
exceptional about it?
So in 1885, in his franchise bill, he tried to give votes to women and Indigenous people, and this was, right during the Northwest Rebellion at the same time. So he was progressive in that fashion. Ultimately, it was too much for people to handle. The vote was not given to women at that time. The bill was watered down to give votes just to qualifying Indigenous people who lived east of Manitoba. But this is a little known part of the history of Sir John A. Macdonald. But in Richard Gwynn's biography of Macdonald, he talks about this moment. And he says, this needs to be rescued from obscurity, is that Macdonald was trying to do some of these progressive things in the 1880s that people seem to have forgotten about.
Now, the next prime minister I noticed to have gone through something of a dramatic reappraisal, of course, not as dramatic as MacDonald, is Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the country's first French-Canadian prime minister. His government actually reversed the Electoral Franchise Act, and Indigenous peoples didn't get the right to vote again until 1960. And to borrow a line from you, no one's torn down any statues of him, at least not yet.
Yeah, and I think this is partly that the moment when people were taking down statues of Sir John A. Macdonald was a particular moment in time. In 2019, 2020, there were unusual things happening in the United States. There were repercussions of this in Canada. And a lot of that anger, because I think a lot of this was built on emotion and anger as opposed to reason, a lot of that has faded. And so Laurier has been able to slide under the radar a little bit there. But I think a case can actually be made that the Laurier government was more injurious to Indigenous people than the Macdonald government was. Just one quick example. The report of Dr. Peter Bryce that came out, he wrote a couple of reports, and one of them was, I think it was in 1907 or 1909, something around there, where he reported on how terrible the conditions were in Indigenous schools. And he made many recommendations that needed to be addressed, but the Laurier government virtually ignored most of them. And so that was one stain on the Laurier record. And as well, they were basically stealing the land from the reserves and selling it off to other folks, and in what we could call, I guess, a land grab that was very egregious on the part of the Laurier government. So there's lots of mistakes by the Laurier government for sure.
Now, another interesting case, we talk about MacDonald's image, we talk about Laurier's image, and then we have someone like Sir Robert Borden, who's forgotten despite shepherding Canada through something as momentous as World War I. Was that surprising to you?
I was a little surprised that, when the statue of Robert Borden was unveiled in 1957 on Parliament Hill, I remember the CBC broadcast that I quote in the book says, based on the number of people that have come out to this statue unveiling, it appears that the work of Robert Borden has faded away from the latest generation of Canadians. And I think a case like this can be made for most of our prime ministers. We just talked about Laurier, and there's even a day on the calendar called Sir Wilfrid Laurier Day. It's on November 20th every year. But we don't hear a lot of people invoking Laurier rhetorically or just as another example. And many of our prime ministers have been forgotten. And Borden is another. And I think I quote a line from a Granitstein book that he co-authored with Graham Rollison called The Canada 100, the 100 most important Canadians of the 20th century. And they begin their Borden chapter by saying, probably not one person in 1,000 could tell you who Robert Borden was. And I think it's probably true in Canada today. And it goes to show you another reason why I wrote the book and feel it's important to put the history of Canada's prime ministers back in the public sphere.
Now, I want to switch gears a little bit. The book is ordered chronologically, not by ranking, but I've done a little math here, and it might surprise you. In terms of real estate in the book, who comes out on top? And maybe you know this already, but at number one is Pierre Trudeau with 29 pages, Mackenzie King at 26, Brian Mulroney, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and Johnny MacDonald are tied for third place with 24 pages each. And Jean Chrétien at 20, Justin Trudeau at 22, Jean Chrétien at 20, and then Stephen Harper, Lester B. Pearson at 19. Then we go down to John Diefenbaker, Louis St. Laurent, R.B. Bennett, Paul Martin, Arthur Meehan, and then there's Mark Carney at number 15, and then we have Kim Campbell at 16, and then of course we have the Lost Prime Ministers after MacDonald, the four of them, and it's a great book that you point out, and then Joe Clark and John Turner share a chapter. Are you surprised about the real estate and how it kind of lines up in some sort of informal ranking?
No, I'm happy to hear about it because I'd never done the ranking by page numbers in the book, and I think it's an interesting way of looking at it. And the first thought I had when you mentioned off the top, I think you said Trudeau was number one,
Mhm.
and Mackenzie King number two, Brian Mulroney number three, and so my first reaction there was, at least in terms of Pierre Trudeau and Brian Mulroney, those were two really big personalities that occupied a lot of space in the psychology of Canadians, whether that was for good or ill, and usually it was for both, with both of those prime ministers. And then of course Mackenzie King was the country's longest serving prime minister at 21 years, so I'm not surprised that he took up real estate in the top three. So part of this is about historical significance. Part of this is about psychological space that the prime ministers played in their time for Canadians, and it seems to fit, and it's an interesting way of calculating these prime ministers by looking at how much room they took up in the book.
I forget whose line it is, but it's a line about Trudeau. It may have been Peter C. Newman, and it's something like, "He bugs us still."
Well, so he's talking about Brian Mulroney when he says he
Oh,
bugs us still, but the riff. This is an allusion to what Stephen Clarkson and Christina McCall Newman wrote for their biography of Pierre Trudeau, and the opening line of it was, "He haunts us still." So that's the famous line that's lived on in Canadian history. So Newman is riffing on that in a great line. He bugs us still. And it's a terrific allusion to a previous comment about Pierre Trudeau. He haunts us still.
now, just as an aside, years ago, I interviewed Michael Bliss, the author of Right Honorable Men, in 2006 when Paul Martin was defeated. And I think I just cold called him at the U of T, and I asked him if he was going to devote a chapter to Paul Martin in an updated version of the book. And his one-line response to me was, "I only devote chapters to important prime ministers." What do you think of that?
Well, I have a big bone to pick with Michael Bliss. You know, the late Michael Bliss. He's no longer with us, of course, but in his book Right Honorable Men, that was published in 1994, he skipped a chapter on Louis Saint Laurent. There was no single chapter on him. And Michael Bliss, he didn't have a lot of good things to say about Louis Saint Laurent. He kind of felt that he was, governed with a silver spoon in his mouth because it seemed to be an easy thing to do in the 1950s when he was prime minister from 1948 to 1957. But I believe all the prime ministers deserve a treatment, and whether they served for just 69 days. Charles Tupper, the shortest serving prime minister, he's got a few pages in my book. Kim Campbell has a full chapter. And if you were prime minister, I think you had something to say about the country, you had something to contribute to the country. And that's why I've given the distinction of at least a title for all of my prime ministers. As you mentioned, the four who served after Sir John A. Macdonald, I combined them into a single chapter. John Turner, Joe Clark, a single chapter. And I don't know if you noticed this, John, but I left Kim Campbell in a unique chapter of her own. And I know she only served for prime minister for about 120 days or so. But because she was the country's only female prime minister, I felt that I would put her in a chapter all of her own.
Now, another thread I wanted to touch on here is the office of the prime minister, the PMO. A couple of books I've read this year suggest that it's become too powerful. There's Andrew Coyne, talking about the power of the PMO and the crisis of Canadian democracy, and how the concentration of the power of the PMO has been going on since at least Pierre Trudeau's era, as another book, The Coots Diaries, shows, which is Jim Coots's private
Yeah.
diaries. What do you make of this concept that the PMO is too powerful, that it's almost become like an imperial position in a sense?
I understand some of it, but I think there is a pathway to be a very successful prime minister by distributing some of the responsibility to your important cabinet ministers. And probably the last prime minister to do this was Jean Chrétien. And he was a successful prime minister. He won 3 elections, governed well, has a decent reputation in history. But he was a bit of an old school prime minister who learned the craft under Lester B. Pearson, who was also a prime minister who relied on the public service, relied on his cabinet. So I don't think people really like the concentration of power in the single person of the prime minister in the prime minister's office. I think it caused problems for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And we know that even his cabinet ministers had trouble getting one-on-one meetings with Justin Trudeau. So Mark Carney, I think if he's smart, he'll distribute some of that power. I'm not so sure that he's been doing it yet. It's still a bit early to tell. But the concentration of power, I mean, being prime minister, you need a strong team behind you regardless. And so my advice would be find some really smart people to rely on and use them strategically. And of course, the buck always stops with the prime minister. That's not going to change. That's important. That's been the case since the days of Sir John A. Macdonald. But there are different pathways to running your team.
What do you hope people get out of this book?
My hope is that for those people who are looking for a reintroduction to Canadian history and maybe want to brush up on their prime ministers, is that this book is a great invitation to reimagining or rediscovering what Canadian history is all about, how politics at the leadership level have made a difference in the lives of Canadians. And when we're all trying to search for a little bit of our sovereignty, I think sovereignty begins with understanding your country and understanding your history. And this book is one that does it, I think, in a entertaining and interesting way. You're not going to get bogged down in heavy details. You're going to have a nice general romp through the great events of Canadian history and the people who were leading us. And as the subtitle of the book is, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. And I think you'll get a sense of that for those who pick up the book.
The name of the book is The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. It is published by Sutherland House. My thanks to author J.D.M. Stewart.
My pleasure.